Our discussion today will focus on situations in which we have two animals, and each one, although they're a pair, has to be designated for a different zevach, for a different carbon. How do we determine which animal will go for which carbon? And that's the sugya on Daf Mem Amid Beis. We're going to learn Daf Mem Aleph Amid Aleph. The sugya there is referring the previous sugya to Shnei Seirim of Yom Kippurim. One Seir was Lashem, the other was Azazel. And the determination, which would single out which was Hashem and which was Azazel, was achieved through a lottery, through what's called a goral. You have another case where you have to determine and single out which of the two animals goes for which carbon, and that's in the case of what's called kinim with a kuf. And that's going to be the sugya that we're going to talk about now. And the author of this sugya is none other than Rav Chisda. So we're going to start with Amar Rav Chisda, which is 4 lines down from the top on Daf Mem Aleph. Ein hakinim misparshos. Now, kinim are made up of 2 birds, which are either torim or bnei yona, doves or turtle doves. And one of those 2 is designated as a carbon ola, and the other as a carbon chatas. And together, these 2 birds are called a ken, or kinim in the plural. And we'll soon see that a yoledis, for example, has to bring these 2 birds, one as an ola and the other as a chatas. So Rav Chisda says that there are 2 critical moments of time at which you can single out one bird as an ola and the other as a chatas. What are these 2 periods of time? We'll call them T1 and T2, and nothing in between. It's got to be either T1 or T2. Ella, number 1, o b'lekichas habaylim, or number 2, o b'asiyas kohen. Now, Bailim is a reference to that person who has to bring the carbon. And in the case of Yoledes, she will be designated as the Bala carbon, and she therefore, when she purchases these 2 birds, then she can decide to designate one for Chatas and one for Ola. Once having done so, that's Koveh the shame that this bird is Ola, this one is Chatas, and it cannot be changed. The Kohen has no control or dominion once she has made that determination. However, let's say that she did not specify which bird is for which carbon. Then there's another critical moment, which is a candidate for being mafarish, for determining which bird goes for what. And that's the moment of Asiyas Kohen, which is the moment in which the Hakrava, the Kohen, is about to be makriv these 2 birds. He will decide which one is a chatos and which one is an ola. But if, on the other hand, the Bala carbon, after the purchase was made, would determine and designate one for a chatos, one for an ola, that's not binding. The Kohen will decide later on at the time of the hakrava. So that the middle point in time between T1, which is called Lakicha, and T2, which is called Asiya, that time is not appropriate and doesn't lend itself for misparshals, for designating an ola or a chatos. Amar Rav Shimi bar Ashi, my taima de Rav Chizda. Where did Rav Chizda derive this halacha that there are these two critical moments? And the answer is b'chsiv, because we have two psukim, and both of them appear in Sefer Vayikra. One is in the 12th chapter of Sefer Vayikra, in the Parsha of Yoledes, and there it says, with regard to a Yoledes, if she is poor and she cannot afford what's called a keves liola, then the Torah says, and I'll read the entire pasuk, it's not all printed in our Gemara, V'lakcha shtei torim o shnei bnei Yonah, echad liola v'echad lechatos. In other words, if she is rich, again, rich means that she can afford it, then she brings only one carbon, and that's a carbon ola, and that's a keves. If she's poor and she can't afford a carbon ola, then she'll bring two karbanos that are much, much less expensive. They are ophos, they are either shtei torim, shnei bnei Yonah, and one will be for an ola. Now she has to add another carbon, and the other bird is lechatos. Now the Torah emphasizes the word v'lakcha, milashon lekicha, which means at the moment that she purchases the two birds, that's a candidate moment, a ripe moment for her to designate which bird will be for chatas and which for ola. But then we have a parsha of Zav, and that's in Vayikra Perek Tesvav. And I'll read the entire pasuk there in the parsha of Zav. There it says, "V'yasa osam hakohen echad chatos v'echad ola." The Zav, in the process of purifying himself, like the case that we had before, the Yoledes brings two birds, one for a chatos and one for an ola. And the Torah says that the designation is made by the Kohen. The asa osam hakohen echad lechatos v'echad leola. We have something similar, by the way, which is not quoted here in the Gemara. In the case of Mitzorah, if Mitzorah is poor, in Vayikra Yudal, v'asa es ha'echad min hatorim mibnei Yonah tasig yado, and once again, it's the Kohen who, at the time of the akrava, could designate this for ola, this for chatos, and therefore, says Rav Shimi Bar Ashi, since we have these two psukim, therefore there are two potential moments for designation. O bilikicha, either as we saw in the parsha of Yoledes, where the Torah says vilakcha, or O basiya, as we saw in the parsha of Zav, where the Torah says v'yasal samat kohen. Meisvei, the Gemara now goes back to the Shnei Seirim of Yoma Kippurim and quotes a brisa, and from that brisa we're going to reject the shita of Rav Chizda. What does it say in the brisa? Now the brisa opens up with the last two words in a pasuk. I'll read the whole pasuk. And regarding the two goats of Yom Kippurim, the Torah says, "V'kriv Aaron es hasair asher Allah love hagorol Hashem v'yasau chatos." Now it seems from the simple, straightforward meaning of the pasuk that hagorol oseh hachatos. The beginning of the pasuk it says, Es hasair asher Allah olav hagorah lashem. That's what is designated as a chatas. And therefore we derive the conclusion from in this brisa that we're learning now that ein Hashem osa lechatas. That in the absence of hagrola, there was no lottery, and therefore the sa'ir has not been determined that it's lashem chatas. A verbal declaration in which the Kohen designates this Sa'ir as a Chatos Hashem is not valid. Only the Gorel has the power to determine which Sa'ir is Lashem and which Lazaza, but not the Kriyat Shem, not the pronouncement of the Kohen. And now, the Gemara tries to clarify why we need this drasha of the Asol Chatos to establish that only the Gorel can determine these two Se'irim. What was the Havamina? Otherwise, that Kriyat Shem should be sufficient, and therefore we need the Pasuk V'Asol Chatos Lafuke to exclude from that Havamina. Sheyocha. I might have thought, if not for the Pasuk V'Asol Chatos, let's derive Kriyat Shem in the case of the Shnei Se'irim from a Kal Vachomer. Hello, Dinu. Uma b'makom shelo kidesh hagorol. In all other korbanos, for example, when we have the two birds, the ophos, one of which goes for an ola and the other for a chatos, we have no din of gorol, and yet kiddush Hashem. The status of, or the determination of the ola and the chatos is established by kriyas Hashem. Is therefore makom shekidei chagorol in the case of the Shnei Se'irim, where the Torah tells us explicitly that the gorol could determine which one is Hashem and which was Hagaz. Eino din, how much more so shekidei Hashem? If in a place like other karbanos that come in pairs, two birds, one ola, one chatas, the Torah doesn't even recognize a lottery. There's no such thing as a gorol, and yet kriyas Hashem generates the designation, and how much more so in the case of the Shnei Se'irim, where the Torah gave us another method of determining which is the Lashem and which is Lazazel through the Gorel, how much more so should Kriyat Shem be effective? Talmud Lomar, and for that we needed this drush of Asol Chatos. Gorel Osa Chatos, V'yein Kriyas Hashem Osa Chatos. Okay, very interesting brisa, but what does it have to do with Rav Chizda? So the Gemara now analyzes v'ahacha here in the case of the Shnei Se'irim, the lav shas lekicha. When is the gorel? The gorel is not shas lekicha. On Erev Yom Kippur, way before Yom Kippur, they purchased two identical he-goats, and there was no determination made. The lav shas asiyah. The gorel is going to come in between the lekicha and the asiyah, meaning the akrovas hakarban, or in the case of the mishtalef, the shiluach hakarban. And yet, nevertheless, ukitani dekava. It says that it's the gorol that is kovea, which is Lashem and which is Lazazel. So we see clearly that even during periods of time, so to speak, a section of time which is in between lekicha and between lekicha and asiyah, you can establish which carbon goes where, which is the animal that goes Lashem, which is Lazazel. In the case of the two birds, which is for an ola and which is for a chatos. So we see clearly from this brisa that although in other karbanos we don't have a gorel that's makadesh, but yet we have a kriyat shem that's makadesh, and the brisa, by analogy, compares kriyat shem and other karbanos to the cases of sar Lashem, sar lazazel, meaning that here too, in the Havamid at least, kriyat shem would be effective. And it would be effective to replace the gorel, but the gorel didn't take place neither b'shas lekicha nor b'shas asiyah. Amar Rava comes to defend Rav Chizda, and he says, "You know what? I'm going to agree with you that Rav Chizda is right. You cannot be kover the kedusha of each of these two birds, except for shas lekicha, shas asiyah. B'hachi kama." But here's how we're going to interpret the brisa. If not for the pasuk of chatos, of asol chatos, we would have derived the following kal v'chomer. Ma b'makom shelo kidei chagoro. In other korbanos like kineophos, in the case of lettuce, etc., the gorol could not be mekadesh the korban. Va'afilu b'shas lekicha, va'afilu b'shas asiyah. There's no meaningful gorol, neither b'shas lekicha when the Bailam purchased these two birds, nor b'shas asiyah when the Kohen brought these two birds. And nevertheless, kiddush Hashem, there is a meaningful, effective kriyas Hashem of chatas and ola, b'shas lekicha, b'shas asiyah. Is therefore the makom in the case of Sarsha, the Sirim of Yom Kippurim, Chakidesh Hakoro, Shalom b'shas lekicha, v'shalom b'shas asiyah, eino din sheyikadesh Hashem b'shas lekicha, b'shas asiyah. The thrust and the goal of this kal v'chomer is to establish kriyas Hashem is effective either at shas lekicha or at shas asiyah, reflecting the shita of Rav Chizda. Amalom rasol chatos hagorol osa chatos, the ein Hashem osa chatos. Toshma. Now the Gemara is going to ask a kasha on Rav Chizda from a different brisa. This brisa is referring to what's called a korban olav yored, a korban that the determination of the korban is a reflection, is determined by the financial status of the person. And we're talking about a mitame migdash, which means a tame who inadvertently, b'shogeg, entered into the Beis HaMikdash. And the Torah says he has to bring a korban ola v'yored. And this is formulated by the Torah in a parsha that we'll read in about 2 weeks' time. It says in Bamidbar Yutes, Pasuk Chaf, regarding a person who came in contact with an avela or with a sheretz, and then he entered into the Mikdash. If he did so, b'mezid he's chayiv kares, b'shogeg he brings a korban ola v'yored. And ola v'yored going up and going down is a reflection of the different financial expenditures he's going to have to pay. If he's an ashir, he brings an animal for a chatas. If he's an ani, he's a poor person, he brings shtei torim or shnei b'nei yona, birds, one for an ola, one for a chatas. If he doesn't, by the way, have enough money for 2 birds, then he brings an asiris ha'efal of minchas chatas. And all this we'll see in the beginning of Sefer Vayikra Perek Hey. By the way, the same halach applies not only in the case of a tameh who inadvertently entered into the Mikdash, but also to a tameh who inadvertently ate kudshim. And if he's eating kudshim b'mezid b'tumah, he's chayiv kares. If he was a shogeg, he brings a korban olav yored. Now, this korban olav yored is not restricted to the case of tumas migdash. It also applies in Vayikra Hey to the case of shama kol olah, which means that a litigant, what we call a plaintiff, is mashbia 2 witnesses that they have testimony and they refuse. They accept the shvua and claim they don't have testimony. Then we find out and they admit that they had testimony. They have to bring a korban ola v'yored. Our Gemara apparently quotes the case of Tamei Shenichnas L'Mikdash because of all the cases of a korban ola v'yored. This is the most common scenario. That's what Tosfos says here. Dibra Masel Metame towards the end of the daf. Fine. Now, what happens in this case, in this complicated brisa of a Metame Migdash? He walked into the Migdash B'tumah as a shogeg, and he has to bring a korban ola v'yored. Ani, he is a poor person. He has to bring shtei torim al shnei bnei Yona, one for an ola, one for a chatas. Vehifrish mos lekino. He designated a certain sum of money to purchase shtei torim o shnei bnei Yona. And as luck would have it, after he designated these two birds, Ishir, his Alta Zeda passed away, and he inherited a bomb of money, and now he's an usher. The halacha of an usher is that he cannot bring two birds. He's got to bring a korban behema, not a korban ophos. He's an usher. But the man is a bit confused. He's not aware of the fact that his designation of ma'os for a kan sipor, meaning for two birds, is no longer valid. And therefore, v'acharkach, unbeknown to him, thinking mistakenly that he could bring shtei torim, which he can't bring because he's an usher now, Omar, he makes a declaration, Elu, these mos on the right side, are lechatos, Elu, the mos on the left side, are liola. And he made a big mistake because now he's an usher, and all his money has to go for a behema for a chatos, because as an usher, a metami migdash could only achieve atonement through a behema, but not through ophos. So what does he do in this case? So the Brisa says there's one half an answer that's very simple, and that is the money that he designated for a chatas bird, and now as an usher he's chayav a chatas behema, he can use that money. Again, it's only a pittance. He's going to make up the difference and use that money and allocate it for a chatas behema. Mosif umevi lechovasa mitvei chatasa. So let's say he had 10 coins, 5 for a chatas bird and 5 for an ola bird. The 5 for a chatas bird now can be used to buy a behema for chatas. If he's an usher, he's going to have to add another 45 to make it 50, whatever it is. But Eino Mosif umevi chovasa, but mitmei olaso is Eino Mosif umevi chatasa. You cannot use money that's allocated for an ola for a chatos. If it was allocated for a chatos, even if it was a chatos oaf, you can redirect it as a chatos behema. But if it was allocated as a chatos, as mos for an ola, you cannot redirect mos of an ola for chatos. Now again, it seems that the money that he allocated for an ola, which cannot be used now for a chatos as an osher, is a valid allocation. And if he would have remained an ani, then he would use that money for a chatos bird and the other money for an ola bird. What's going on? This is against Rav Chisda. V'ahacha, in this case, after he became an ashir, now he designates these mos for an ola and these for a chatos. The lav shas l'kicha v'la shas asiyah. This is neither the shas l'kicha. He had already purchased the two birds as an ani a month ago, and of course we're not bringing these two birds on the mizbeach because he can only bring a behema now that he's an ashir. And yet, Ktani, it says in this brisa, Dikava, he has successfully, and we validate the designation of these mos for an ola and these for a chatos, such that he cannot be mosiv on the dmei ola to make up the differential, the increment to a behemoth chatos. Why is this designation valid? According to Rav Chisda, it's neither shas l'kicha nor shas asiyah. Rav Sheshes says, you know what? In the world of brisos, we have the good guys and the bad guys. What do I mean? Many of the brisos, unfortunately, cannot be maintained with an integral interpretation. There is an inner conflict or contradiction, a kasha that we have on the brisa that leads us to classify the brisa as what's called mishubeshes. It's an incorrect transmission. Says Rav Sheshes, you're asking from this brisa, and you're assuming that this brisa makes sense, and it is a reliable brisa. I am going to prove to you that this brisa cannot make any sense, that it's a mishubeshta, and you have no right to quote and invoke this brisa as a question, as a contradiction to Rav Chisda v'tizbara. You're of the opinion that this is a reliable brisa, eino mishubeshes, and therefore you raise an objection, a contradiction to Rav Chisda from this brisa. I'm going to prove to you, based on a statement of Rabbi Elazar, that this brisa is a mistaken brisa. It's a mishubeshes. For Omar Rabbi Elazar, Omar of Hoshaya, mitame migdash ashir, vehevi korban ani, lo yatsa. If a man walked into the migdash and he was tameh, a shogeg case, and he's got plenty of bucks in the bank. I don't know if he has American dollars or Canadian dollars, but he has enough funds in the bank. Now he's chayav to bring a kivsa as a korban chatos. And instead, he shows up in the Mikdash with two ophos, with two birds, which hevi korban ani. Again, maybe the Kohen was mistaken for not checking out his bank account, but the Kohen assumed innocently that this man is an ani, and that's why he's bringing two birds. Lo yatsa. He has not fulfilled his mitzvah. An ashir is obligated to bring a kizva lechatos, and he cannot get away with two birds. Oh, says the Gemara, kevan de lo yatsa hechi kava. How can you tell me that there is an absolute validity? And the halacha recognizes when he allots money for an olah, and money for an olah bird, and money for a chatas bird, that's valid, such that now he can't change it later on. What are you talking about? The man is an ashir. If he's an ashir, he can't be koveya by making a declaration that these modes are for an olah. He's not chayav a korban olah. He's chayav a korban chatas. He's got to bring a kizbah. He's an ashir. This brisa is not a reliable brisa. Ella, says Rav Sheshes, we have no choice. But my islach maybe the only thing that we could say in order to answer this kasha is that the brisa never meant to say that a man who's an ashir and then he designates money for an olah and a chatos, that it was a valid kviyus. But rather, kvar omar me'aniyasa. What the brisa means is that when he was an ani, then he designated money for an olah and a chatos. This bird as an olah and this as a chatos. So we have to change the text of the brisa, says Rav Chase. We have no choice. And our text has to be amended to read mitame mikdash ani, Shehifrish Mos Lakino. He was an ani when he designated the money. And he said, then he became an ashir. So at the time when he designated and divvied up the money, and he was called Korei B'Shem, he was in fact an ani, and therefore his Kriyat Shem is valid. And when did that happen? At the moment that he was mafresh these mos, and that's the moment of lekicha. Is hachenami shekvar omar b'shas hafrosha. And let's answer up the brisa with regard to the zman of kriyat shem, and we should make a a change in the text of the brisa, and it should be read mitame migdash ani shehifish mos lekino shekvar omar mishas hafrosha. That when he designated the most for his karman, and he said these are for chatos, these for ola, that is considered the shas hafroshas mos, which equals the shas lekichas ofos, and that's why his kriyat shem and his kaveya is valid. And now the Gemara is going to try to prove that it's not fair to change the text of the brisa simply because of the sheet of Rabbi Lazar, who says that an ashir who brings a carbon ani lo yatsa, because there's another opinion in the Tanoim, and they'll have to take this brisa literally as is. Ula Rab Chaga, Amar Rab Yoshia, the Amar Yotza, if a Metame Migdash B'Shogeg was an usher and he came and somehow he got away with bringing two ophos, one for an ola, one for a chatos, Yotza. Even though he's an usher, he can bring a carbon ani, and post facto he will be Yotze his fear. He will fulfill this obligation if he brings a carbon ola v'yored of two ophos, one for an ola and one for a chatos. And therefore, the Gemara claims that Rav Sheshes, you don't have any right to, to issue a death sentence on this brisa and assume that the brisa must be a mishubeshta. It's not a proper brisa, and then start playing around and changing the gears.